right, well, here we are, and welcome. We're going to finish up the discussion on biblical inerrancy tonight, and so let me just say a prayer for us, and then we will get to it. So, Father, thank you so much for tonight, and I just ask that you will be glorified through our study and just help us to understand more about your word and give you these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we left off, we were talking about biblical inerrancy, and where we've gotten to, and what I'm going to talk about tonight, is just this claim that's often made. A lot of people, when they approach the subject of biblical inerrancy, and they don't believe in inerrancy, the final objection to it is just that they would say it is simply not true that the Bible is without errors. And then a lot of times you'll hear people throw out this idea, well, the Bible is full of contradictions. And so that's the reason I'm kind of titling this section, of course, it's the next part of biblical inerrancy, but we're also kind of titling it Biblical Contradictions with a question mark, just because that was easier for me than writing out on the board, does the Bible have contradictions? And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do a little bit of an exercise. I'm going to introduce the kind of some ground playing rules, and then we're going to look at a few specific examples. So, here's my suggestion, first of all. If you're ever talking to somebody and they say, well, the Bible is full of contradictions, the first thing to do is tell them, show me one. Because that usually ends the conversation, because most people have heard that from, I don't know, university professors or people on TV or somebody at home, and a lot of people don't know even what they're thinking of when they say the Bible is full of contradictions. However, if you're dealing with someone a little more savvy, they are going to propose some contradictions. And what I want to do tonight is I'm not going to in any way go through every example that somebody has suggested is a Bible contradiction. We are going to look at a few, and what I'm going to kind of do is lay out a method for how we approach this sort of thing. Now, I want to say that a lot of this question really does come down to what you're ready to believe about the Bible to start with. Sometimes we are dealing with matters of faith. I only say that because when I talk about some of the contradictions people talk about, if you believe in the Bible, you're probably going to be like, that's it? That's the reason people say the Bible has errors? But for people who think that, a lot of times we have to admit there's some people that they have reasons they don't want to think the Bible's the Word of God. And if somebody has their mind made up, you're probably not going to convince them that they're wrong. But there might be some people who just have that idea that the Bible's full of contradictions and you can actually talk reason with. And a lot of times, just some very simple observations will reveal that what seemed like a contradiction isn't really a contradiction. It is on the surface, but it's not a true contradiction. I want to, if anybody's interested in going a little deeper in this, there's a lot of good books that have set out to harmonize Bible contradictions. And I'm actually going to write a couple of titles on the board just because if anyone's interested in going deeper, I used to have every title I wrote on the board. I don't usually find myself needing them all that often, and so I usually end up giving them away or loaning them out. So there's 3 books I used to have that I don't think I have anymore, and I can't remember if I loaned them out or gave them away. So actually, one of these we might have in the library. But the best for my money, it's a little bit of an oldie, but is the Encyclopedia of Bible. Let's see how the room is going here. And if you can't, I know some of you out there in Facebook land can't see it very well, but difficulties. I'm going to erase these in a minute. I'm just writing them down in case anybody needs this. And that is, the author is a guy, he's with the Lord now, but Gleason, Gleason, Archer. And that's just a phenomenal book on, harmonizing these supposed contradictions in the Bible. In fact, I'll write one more down. Let's see, quote marks on its title. The next one I would mention is Hard Sayings of the Bible. And this one is, a lot of people worked together on this, but it was edited by a guy whose name was Walter, still is, this guy's still alive, Kaiser. Just like the German king word. So those are two really good resources. We have Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties by Gleason Archer, Hard Sayings of the Bible by Walter Kaiser. There's another one that I'm not going to write down just because, I don't know, we'll be gentle on my wrist, but it's called When Critics Ask. When Critics Ask, and that one is by Norman Geisler. So, but like I said, this is the one I really recommend that will walk you through these really well. And I think this was written in like the late 70s, but it's just as good now and just as relevant now as it was then. All right. Anyone need this to be up here still? All good. I just know I'm going to want to write one or two more things. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some supposed contradictions, and just what I want to kind of explain is that usually there's a very simple explanation why something is not a contradiction. Occasionally we need to dig a little more deeply, but any of these things, if you can't figure the answer out yourself readily, the truth is out there. You might need to look it up. Sometimes, because we're dealing with ancient documents from the ancient world, sometimes there are historical things that some people are missing. Sometimes there are things about language and culture that people are missing. And sometimes we have what are called scribal errors. Now, when I say scribal errors, remember we talked about last week how our Bible is based on copies of copies of copies, and those are almost identical, but they're not always completely identical. And sometimes there might be a copyist error that we can explain really easily how that error crept in. So if you stay with me, I'll just walk you through some of these, and then we'll go through them. First one is pretty straightforward. The first category, some people talk about grammatical errors. Well, I'm writing that. Somebody, Jake, why don't you look up, if you don't mind, John chapter 1, verse 5. And Holly, why don't you look up John 8:28. So, Jake, John 1, 5, Holly, John 8:28, and grammatical errors. Some people say, and this one's kind of silly, but, well, if the Bible is without error, there shouldn't be any error in the normal use of language. There was actually a famous linguist, and he totally believes the Bible is the Word of God, a guy named Bruce Metzger, phenomenal language scholar, but when asked, Dr. Metzger, do you believe in biblical inerrancy? He said he didn't, and they asked why, and he said, well, the Bible violates normal rules of grammar. All respect to Dr. Metzger, I don't think he fully understood what evangelicals mean by inerrancy. I think he was actually giving a lecture at Dallas Seminary where I studied when they had that discussion. But, Jake, read John 1:5 if you don't mind.
And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not.
And the light, and he's reading from the Old King James, and the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Some of your more modern translations say the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Now, what's the grammatical error? It goes from present to past. And that's not how we usually use English grammar. But one of the things you have to understand about the New Testament, especially the Gospel of John, because we're dealing with God, a lot of times they will bend the rules of English grammar to make a point about God, a theological point. And it's not an error because it's deliberate. It's a deliberate misuse of grammar to make a point. Like, and the point is that the light, because Jesus rose from the dead, the light, his light continues to shine but there was a time where darkness tried to overcome the light, which was the cross. One more Holly on the same vein, and then we'll talk about it a little more. 858, if you don't mind, sister.
I thought you said 828.
Okay, well, it shouldn't be too hard to get to 858.
No, it's fine. Okay.
Count forward.
I tell you the truth, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am.
Before Abraham was born, I am. And here we have another grammatical violation that's deliberate to make a theological point. Jesus has associated himself with the God of the Old Testament, the I am. So before Abraham was, past tense, I am. He's like using a present tense, like I'm there now before he was born. It's talking about the eternality of Jesus, but yeah, it's a deliberate bending of the grammar to say something about God that's not easy to make with the normal conventions of language. Um, and so when we talk about biblical inerrancy, we're talking about content. We're not talking about grammatical rules. I know this is hard for some people to understand, but rules of grammar aren't always as fixed as people want them to be, because sometimes you bend grammar to make the point you're trying to make. I mean, I don't know if you guys know what it means to split an infinitive, but to split an infinitive means you put an adjective between to and the verb. Let me show you a very famous split infinitive, and it's an example of a very famous person who deliberately violated English grammar. And we don't say, oh, that guy was a dummy. We're like, oh, that kind of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? To boldly go. I don't know why I'm capping everything, but to boldly go. What's that from? Anybody? To boldly go where no one or no man or whatever has gone before. Star Trek, right? Gene Roddenberry, he put together this split infinitive that has become one of the most famous grammatical violations in history. It just means you should say to go boldly, but imagine if Captain Kirk had been like, to go boldly where no man has gone before. It probably wouldn't have been as famous. So we're not talking about grammatical violations when we talk about inerrancy. It's really kind of a silly argument. However, the next one is a little bit trickier, which is what we call, may as well get rid of this, don't need you. Numerical orders. What do we do when the numbers don't add up? Now, I don't have a PowerPoint for this, so when I talk about some of the passages, you're just going to either have to take my word for it or look it up. You all got Bibles, right? But sometimes numbers they don't exactly match up. For instance, in the historical books in the Old Testament, we have two accounts of the history of the southern kingdom, Judah. One of them is in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings together, and the other is in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And if you read those two accounts, they share a lot of the same historical data, and they match up pretty well, so this really validates that really is the history of Israel, because we have two different documents in our Old Testament. However, occasionally numbers don't mesh perfectly. So, let me give you an example. In 2 Samuel 10:18, we have these numbers of the number of Arameans who David defeated in battle. And we have 700 charioteers, which is a fancy way of saying dudes that drive chariots. And we have, in this verse, we have 40,000 horsemen. Now, in 2 Chronicles 19:18, very clearly the same battle. Oh man, we have, would you believe it, 7,000 charioteers instead of 700. Make sure I was looking at that right? And I'm just going to write CH for charioteers to save myself some trouble. And then we get another curveball thrown at us because in 2nd Chronicles it says 40,000. And instead of horsemen it says foot soldiers. Oh my goodness. How can my faith possibly survive the fact that this one says 700 charioteers and this one says 7,000, this one says horsemen and this one says foot soldiers? This is almost certainly a copyist error. And again, it's hard to say for sure which of these was exact, but that's not going to make a lot of difference for your faith. The numbers are really easy because it works in Hebrew. It works a lot like it does in English. What is the difference? What is the difference in digits between 700 and 7,000? 10. And when ancient documents were all copied out by hand off of another document, it's not difficult to imagine, bless you, that a copyist could forget to add the equivalent of 10. He's going back and forth, he's wiping sweat from his eyes. He's been doing, I mean, I don't know if any of you, where, we work on computers so much now, I don't know if any of you have had to write things out longhand for hours. If you've ever had to write out stuff longhand for like 8 hours a day, this is what these copyists did. It's not surprising that they would add the equivalent of an extra 0. And very similarly, when you're doing copying in these battle sections of the historical books, sometimes you're talking about how many horsemen, sometimes you're talking about how many charioteers. It's not surprising that a scribe might make an error where he says charioteer here, or horseman, or horseman here, pardon me, or foot soldier here. Which is more likely? We have to think about that. We have to try to figure that out. But again, it's just, if we're thinking deeply about this, I think the original documents would have agreed. But it's a really simple copyist error that just really doesn't make a lot of difference. All right, a little bit of factual data while we're talking about 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. All in all, there are 18 numerical discrepancies between the books of Chronicles and Samuel and Kings. The numbers appear exaggerated by at least one author. In other words, one of the two will have bigger numbers. Critics, those who don't want to believe the Bible is the Word of God, have tried to argue that the author of Chronicles was given to exaggeration because the higher numbers are usually in Chronicles, but 1/3 of the time they're in Kings. So it's not really that someone's given to exaggeration, it's just that sometimes we have imperfect copying on the numbers. And so if somebody holds to inerrancy, they're probably going to assume a copying error. If you're determined to believe this means that there's errors in the Bible, you're probably going to, but it's really easy to explain in a copying error. Now you may ask, why don't they harmonize it in the English Bible? The simple answer is integrity, honesty. These are the numbers as they appear in the Hebrew Bible as we have it, and it's difficult to say for sure which one was the correct number, so we just copy it as we have it. But that shows you that people who are doing Bible translation aren't trying to hide anything from you. They're giving you the real data and assuming if you do a little research, you can understand how something like that could happen. What's that? Okay. Claude corrected me, and I appreciate it, brother. This should say foot soldiers. This should say horsemen. I wrote it backwards. Thank you, brother. No, I like it. Claude has the keen eye, and I like it. So, stuff like that. These things I'm talking about are critics who don't want to believe the Bible is the Word of God. Stuff like this really is the best they got. I mean, it's like sometimes you're like, okay, 7,000 versus 700, or horsemen versus foot soldiers. Someone's trying to prove the Bible's not the Word of God, and it's like, really? That's your best argument? Oh, but this one is really going to do it to you. All right. When they built the temple, when they built Solomon's temple, one of the things they built was this big bronze basin. I'm going to draw you a really cool picture. Oh, I have a blue pen. Now this is not to scale or exact, but we'll just pretend this is something like what the big bronze basin looked like. And what did they do? This looks actually like a picture I once drew for Andrea. I told her I was going to draw her a bath, and then I drew a picture kind of like this. I'm doing this bronze basin, and there I drew you a bath. Okay, but so this blue is supposed to be water in there. Okay, so they would use this for washing, and I was talking a little bit about baptism in the sermon on Sunday, and I was talking about how the Old Testament background is all this washing people had to do all the time. Priests had to wash themselves before doing their priestly duties, and they would do it in this bronze basin. It was, symbolized cleansing from sin. But here's the contradiction. We're given, we're given measurements for the temple. You can see where this is going. You can see how much already this is going to affect your faith in the Bible. So, um, the bronze sea was cast metal, and it was 10 cubits from brim to brim. All right, let me just draw another picture out to the side here. It says it was 10 cubits, and it's not a perfect circle. I don't have my, what do you call that thing you draw? Protractor, thank you. And so we're just going to say this is close enough. So we have 10 cubits long between here and here. Pardon the really crummy penmanship. I had a penmanship teacher who really tried to teach me better. It never stuck. But, oh my goodness gracious, then it says that the circumference was, let's see, where am I at? 30 cubits. Any of you math whizzes seeing the contradiction? If you're not, you probably know more about math than I do, but you might not know this much. Here's the problem. When we work out the mathematical figures, if this was 10 cubits, then the circumference should be 31.14 and change. It's one of those numbers. So 31.14159. All right, mathematically, if this were 10 cubits, then that's the number of cubits it should be around in the circumference. Oh my goodness gracious, this Bible contradiction. This is what some people want to call an error. There are really two possibilities here. One is, I actually meant to bring one of our communion offering trays to illustrate this, but it's okay that I didn't. It's possible that the bronze sea, the bronze basin, had a lip where on the edge of it, I drew it right here, like that, a lip on the edge. And so it could be that 30 cubits would be here, whereas the 31.41 would be from here, but this here is from here to here. I don't really think we have to work that hard to get rid of an error, though. I'm just saying that is one possibility. I think it's much more likely that he was simply rounding off. And I don't think that rounding off constitutes an error, right? Let me think if I could give you an example. If let's say I had $97 in my pocket, and you were like, Pete, how much money do you have? And I was like, oh, $100. And then, somebody maybe get the money out of my pockets, and we counted out it was $97. I'm thinking I would be like, you lied. You said you had $100 and you only had a 97, right? It would be a rounding off. Another example, when people ask how tall I am, I like to say I'm 6'1". I have a secret. I'm 6'1.5". I round up to make myself taller. My point is, I think that probably that's a rounded number. So even if we didn't have to do all this fancy mathematical stuff with the lip, I still don't think we have an error. I think that's just silly.
Would you say you make an error with having Jesus speak at that time?
Some people would say that, but there is Claude asked whether someone would say it's an error that Jesus said that Jesus fed the 5,000. Um, that would be a different kind of error because some people would just say, "Well, I don't believe that really happened." That's an "I don't believe that happened," so it has to be an error. But go ahead.
Well, with the 5,000, it include all the women in short.
Yeah, some have suggested he fed a lot more people, but I think it even says 5,000 men. So, yeah, I don't think. I mean, I don't think that usually is counted as an error, but that's still definitely something you're gonna need to believe in miracles if you're gonna buy it. All right. So, point is, these numerical errors. I think if you're in a sense, if you're willing to buy it, you're probably just going to think there's a very simple solution. And those who aren't willing to accept it are just going to not. You can't convince somebody of anything they're not ready to believe. At least generally speaking, that's true. If you're talking to a skeptic who is just convinced there are errors in the Bible, they'll focus on this numerical stuff like, that proves the Bible's not true. But if you're willing to accept that there could be an explanation, the explanation is usually fairly simple. Next category would be historical errors. Things described differently, actual historical events. Now, this one is a little bit more difficult, but not a lot more, in my opinion. Um, let's let's take an example here. Okay, here's one example. This is 2 Samuel 24:1. And here's the deal. In 2 Samuel 24:1, if my notes are right, I guess I could look it up, but it says that the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, "Go and number Israel and Judah." And so you have the Lord kind of, and there's theological questions here that might be difficult, but right now we're just focusing on what it says. The Lord caused David to take a census to number Israel, so that because he was mad at him and he was gonna get him for it because David wasn't supposed to do that. If you're wondering why it was a big deal for David to number Israel or take a census, it showed that he was trusting in how many men he had rather than trusting in the Lord. That's the issue there. And we know it was wrong because the Lord had told him don't do it. But First Chronicles, First Chronicles 21:1. It says that Satan caused David to do this. That comes off as a pretty big difference. Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So it's kind of like this is one of those rare times in the Bible where it's like, well, who's behind this, God or Satan? And there's actually two possible explanations here. One is simply that God is using Satan as a pawn. God as sovereign, even though Satan thinks he's the big, arch rival, God can make Satan do what he wants. So it's possible that God, in this sense, was using Satan. That's one explanation. God caused Satan to do it, so in some sense, both are true. Go ahead, Holly, before I go on.
No, this is sort of off the topic, but sort of applies to what we're talking about, you're studying about. So why do people think the birth of Jesus? Some people say that it happened in the summertime, and some people think it happened in the winter. I'm just curious, like, is there confusion in the Bible about that?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that question in just one moment. Let me go ahead and finish. I want to finish this point, and then and I'll remember the question. If I don't, I'll ask, because it's a really good question. And it is related to this, and we're about to move into the Gospels. But so one explanation is God used Satan. Sometimes God uses Satan as a tool because God is sovereign. I'd say a much better and more likely explanation is actually that Satan here is not actually being used as a proper name. It's being used in its literal meaning. Here's what I mean. Does anybody know just offhand, I do, so it's okay if you don't, what the word Satan actually means? I'll give you a hint. The devil's original name, the devil is a title, the diabolos, right? The devil's original name was not Satan. The devil's original name was in Hebrew Helel ben Shachar, and that means shining one, son of the dawn, or something like that. If you interpret Isaiah 14 correctly. So why is Satan called Satan? Because he is the great adversary. The word Satan, let's just do this, equals adversary. That's what it means. Or we could even say enemy. So that's point A. Usually, especially in the New Testament, when the word Satan is used, it's used essentially as a proper name. You know, like where he's the adversary and this is kind of taken on this proper name. But it's probable, I would argue, if not only possible, but probable, that in First Chronicles it's not being used as a proper name. In fact, it's not. It's like it doesn't use it like in a way that would make it definite, like the Satan. It uses it in more of a way that would say a Satan. It would be, I'm going to write this out in English. I don't even know if I could write it out in Hebrew if I tried, but Hasatan would be, sorry, that's not very big for you people out there, but Hasatan would be like the adversary. That says adversary, not adverb, okay? But Satan without the ha would be an. So, if it just means an adversary, it doesn't necessarily mean Satan as a proper name. What is probably going on here? The Lord, well, David decides he wants to take a census. He wants to know how many men he has to put in his army. Why does he want to know that? There's probably some other king out there that he's worried is going to be a threat, an adversary, a Satan in the sense of a potential enemy. So he's like, I got to make sure I have enough men to deal with this guy. That's probably what's going on. So the Lord was behind this happening, and the mechanism he used was an adversary who's probably a rival kingdom. Now, I'm not going to tell you I know for sure which of those explanations is right. I think that one probably is, but the point is we have two explanations that would remove the potential contradiction. I'm going to move in a minute into talking about contradictions in the Gospels, because that's where a lot of people really like to focus on them. But before I do that, before I get to that, I want to talk about Holly's question, which was, some people say that Jesus was born in the wintertime. Some people say no, he was probably born in the summertime. Some people, being a little more careful, will probably say we don't know for sure, and they're probably a little closer to right about that. You're thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute. Jesus was born on December 25th. Was he? We don't know for sure, but I'll just tell you a little bit of history here. There was and I'm pretty sure I have all my facts right. If I don't, close. Okay, if you look it up and find that I don't have this exactly right, it's pretty close. So, um, in early Christianity, when Christianity became an illegal religion, they wanted to celebrate the birth of Jesus. But they I think they probably didn't know exactly when he was born, but they wanted a day to celebrate the birth of Jesus. And most historians think the reason they chose December 25th is because there was a big pagan feast that went on that day, and it happened in conjunction, I believe, if I'm right about this, in conjunction with a celebration called the winter solstice. You've probably heard of that. So there's this big pagan festival, and December the 25th was a big feast day. So the Christians are like, well, let's celebrate our holiday on the same day. That way when we're having this big celebration for the birth of Christ, the Roman soldiers aren't going to catch us and be like, well, they're celebrating their God, and that's an illegal religion. This happened with a lot of things in Christianity. So they celebrated the birth of Jesus on December 25th. He may have been born on December 25th. We just don't know. Some people think, man, well, that would have been a pretty rough birth, in a stable situation in the middle of winter. And yeah, it would have. But I think the simple answer is we don't know. But because his birthday was celebrated on a major pagan feast day, most people think that's probably not the actual day he was born on. It's just the tradition because it was a good day to celebrate it. Now, because the Bible never comes out and gives us an exact date, birthday for Jesus, there's no contradiction there. It's just whether the historical tradition is right or not. And I think it'd be a very silly idea to change the day we celebrate the birth of Christ because, it's kind of like, well, some of you may have met people like this who say, well, we shouldn't celebrate these Christian holidays because they were all based on pagan holidays. Easter Sunday, some people think, well, that has its background in the pagan feast of Ishtar, things like that. If you haven't heard about this stuff, good, it's silly. But there are some Christians who are like, we shouldn't celebrate Easter and Christmas because those were pagan holidays. And they always say it in that voice. I don't know why. But the truth is that I like to put it this way: Jesus redeemed the holidays. If I were to put it in a less friendly way, I'd say, well, we stole them, and we did it successfully. We win. The fact that we celebrate the birth of Christ on December 25th and the resurrection on Easter Sunday means we won. Okay, I was born into it, so I didn't do anything, but I'll still cheer myself. Anyways, good question. I don't know what the actual date or even season was when Jesus was born. I think it's hard to nail down. We can date. Go ahead, Jake. I think we actually do with Easter. That and the reason Easter was often celebrated in and around the time of that Ishtar feast, and that's why people are bothered about that. But Easter actually, yeah, because it has to do with, it tells us that it was in conjunction with the Passover, and the Passover is a date on the Jewish calendar. So Easter corresponds to the Jewish Passover, and it's gonna be on a the resurrection is on a Sunday because it would be following a Passover Saturday when that happened, but it'll correspond to that, and that's the reason it changes every year, because for one thing, it has to always be on a Sunday because Passover was always on a Saturday, and for another thing, it corresponds to the Jewish feast. So that one's a little easier to nail down. We don't know exactly what year Jesus was born in, but we have a pretty good idea of it. In other words, just stepping back a minute, and this is a little left field of some of what we're talking about, but it's worth talking about. Virtually no historian in existence denies the fact that Jesus Christ lived, that there was a Jesus Christ who lived and was crucified by the Romans. The resurrection, the fact that he was fully God, they doubt those things. But whether there was a Jewish teacher named Jesus Christ who had a following and was killed by the Romans, nobody really doubts that. Nobody worth their salt, no real historian. And generally, if we were going to be very, how do you say, generous in the possible dates, he was probably born somewhere between around BC 3 and AD 3. So probably within those 6 years, nobody's going to argue very strongly that he wasn't born sometime in that time frame. Now, was he born exactly in AD 1? Maybe not, but pretty close to there. Ancient dating is a little touchy, and traditionally most people think he was crucified and rose from the dead in AD 33, but almost anybody is going to date that between AD 30 and AD 36. Now, when we're dealing with ancient dating, that's pretty precise as things like this in the ancient world go. All right, let me talk a little bit about the Gospels and give you some terminology. And this relates somewhat to historical errors, but I'm actually going to make it a little bigger. Make it more specific to the Gospels. What we call the synoptic problem. What on earth are you talking about, Pastor Vic? Problems in the Bible? Well, there's not real problems, but here's the thing. I'm assuming many of you have probably read all four Gospels. You don't have to show your hands, but I think most of you have read all four Gospels. One of the things you'll find when you read all four Gospels is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are a lot alike, whereas the Gospel of John is much more unique. The Gospel of John is something like 90% unique. There's no contradiction there. It just means he's giving us information about Jesus that the others don't. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke give most of the same information. So far, so good. That's good because it confirms all these events. But if you've read these three, you realize that even though there's vast agreement, there are times when they don't line up in one of three ways. Sorry, camera can't see that hand. One of three ways. One, chronology. What I mean is if you take all the events from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and a lot of them are the same events, but they don't always come in the same order. So some would say, well, those are chronological orders. And if you, chronological orders, that's like, something to do with the restaurant. No, chronological errors. And the problem here, or the issue here, is people not understanding the purpose behind the Gospels. This is not debated, that the events in the Gospels are put in different orders, all right? Nobody's arguing about that. The most conservative fundamentalist Bible teachers aren't arguing that there are chronological differences in the Gospels. The issue is that the Gospels were not written to give exact chronology, and they never claim to have been given to give precise chronology. We're preaching through Mark in church on Sunday mornings right now. You guys know that. And one of the things we were talking about is, why was Mark written? What was the purpose behind it? Now, that takes us to a broader question, which is that, or a broader point, which is that the Gospels were written for a purpose. Were they written to give historical information? Yes. Do they give accurate historical information? Yes. But they're not just written to give information, they're written to give a response. They're written to teach people things about Jesus that will ideally change what they believe and then change the way they live. Now, because of that, the gospel writers, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, God working through them, they felt the freedom to arrange the events of Jesus' life in such a way that best presented the aspects of his life that they were getting at. In other words, they were making a kind of, shall we say, a theological point, and they arranged the events to make the point or make the presentation of Jesus that they were intending to present. Now that bothers a lot of people, but the fact of the matter is, if the Gospels weren't written to give a chronological sequence, it's not an error. That wasn't their purpose, and this is very common in ancient literature. This is kind of a, probably this is why this didn't bother people a whole lot until the last couple of hundred years. This exact chronology thing is kind of a Western idea. When I say Western, I mean like Western Europe and North America. We have this idea, we're really OCD about the exact order of events. But from the perspective of the Gospels, it's like, did the events happen? If they happened in a slightly different order, it's not an error unless their purpose was to give you an exact order. Now, once we can recognize that, we can recognize that these chronological differences are not errors, they're differences of presentation, and that objection melts away. All right. Next category is, with the synoptic problem, is quotation. So, the Gospels, as you know, the synoptic, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have many quotes from Jesus. Jesus says a bunch of stuff. And there's a lot of things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke record Jesus saying. And it's clear he's saying the same thing, but he says it a little differently in the different Gospels. And you've seen that if you've read the three together. We have, in our library, we have a book called A Harmony of the Gospels. If you ever want to see any of this together, it has like these brackets that shows the same events, and you can see slightly different ways of saying things. I'll give you an example, and I see if I have it in my notes. If not, I'll let you look up the verses yourself. I don't have it in my notes, so I'll just tell you. Caesarea Philippi, Jesus is asking this question about who do men say that I am? And they're like, some say you're Elijah, some say you're Moses, some say you're one of the prophets. And Jesus is like, okay, so who do you say that I am? And this is where the Apostle Peter has his shining moment, right? In Matthew, he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Good job, Peter. But when that's recorded in Mark, and it is very clearly the same instance, he says, you are the Christ. And okay, maybe Mark just left out the part about the Son of the living God. Not a real big deal. We can forgive him that. So there's no contradiction there. But then in Luke, well, who do you say that I am? And Luke has Peter saying, you are the Christ of God. And he leaves off the Son of part. And this is where our critic friends are like saying, that's a contradiction. The quote isn't the same. Because Luke says you are the Christ of God. Matthew says you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, once again, this is one of these times where we're like, really? That's it? However, just to be indulgent, just to be gratuitous, our skeptic friends, our critic friends, they don't understand how quotation works in the ancient world as opposed to how quotation works today. Quotation today, we have these nifty little things. They're called quote marks. You've seen them, right? And the real issue in a quotation today is getting the quotation exactly word for word accurate. Now, the fact that you get a quotation word for word accurate just for fun doesn't necessarily mean you've accurately quoted somebody. Let me give you an example, and I'm going to play both sides here because I want you to be clear that I'm not taking sides, but I just want to illustrate how this works. Let's say when President Obama was president, right? Let's say President Obama gave an address, and let's say there's a quote, an exact quote somebody gives. Let's say an analyst on Fox News. We probably all know what that is. An analyst on Fox News is evaluating President Obama's quote. Do you think the Fox News analyst is very likely to give a fair shake to what President Obama was trying to say? Now, they gave the exact quote, right? Just in theory. They gave the exact words he said, but here's what we do in American politics and the interrelation of news with American politics. We try to spin what the person was trying to say to make it sound worse than it did. So Fox News would have taken a quote from President Obama and tried to make it sound worse. Same thing would happen, and again, I'm not telling you what you should think about either of these guys, but the same thing's going to happen if President Trump has a quote and a more, a CNN or something is evaluating his quote. They're probably going to make it sound worse than it is, because that's what journalists do with quotes by politicians if they don't like them. So in our culture, it's like you have to get the words exactly right, but you might use the quote out of context and it's still considered a legitimate quote. In the ancient world, the world of the New Testament, they were a little more forgiving about the exact words. The issue was that you accurately conveyed what the person was trying to say, what the person was intending to say. So, let's just pretend that there were 3 accounts of something. Let's say I asked somebody, let's say, I'm not asking you this, Holly, but let's just say, for instance, I said, Holly, would you please get me a cup of coffee? Now, there might be 3 different accounts of that, and one said, at that point, Pastor Vic asked Holly to get him a cup of coffee. Another one said, and then Pastor Vic said, Holly, would you please get me a cup of coffee? And another one might say, and Pastor Vic said, Holly, would you get me a cup of coffee, please? It would still be an accurate presentation any way you cut it because the content is accurately presented. And that's the way quotations worked in the ancient world. And once we realize that, most of the synoptic problem disappears into thin air. If we understand that they weren't intended to be chronological and we understand that quotes work different in the ancient world, probably like over 90% of the synoptic problem is gone in a poof. We just understand the way the documents work. The last part, though, and this is probably where we'll end up tonight, occasionally, I'll give you one example, occasionally there is a difference between the story and the gospel that is different enough, we need to think a little more deeply. And so, last but not least contradiction of the night in the Gospels is Matthew 20. We have this, let me give you this, Matthew 20, 29 to 30. Here we have, it says, and I'll just highlight the things it says, as they were leaving Jericho. So in Matthew, Jesus and his disciples are leaving Jericho, and 2 blind men sitting by the road, hearing that Jesus was passing by, cried out, Lord, have mercy on us. So, and 2 blind men. 2 blind men, right? Okay. But in Mark, it says, well, Mark also, so we got Mark, what is my reference here? 1046. And we have a leaving, so no problem there. But here we have a blind man. So that's one supposed contradiction somebody will bring up. Well, Matthew says there's 2 blind men, and Mark says there's 1 blind man. That's not really that hard, is it? If there were 2 blind men, this is a drill I do with my college students when I talk about this. Where there are 2, there is at least 1. I mean, obviously, where there are 2, there are at least 2, so that's kind of silly. But if Mark says there was a blind man, if Matthew says there's 2, there was 2. There was 1 if there was 2, right? I mean, let's not get that silly. But the real issue is that in Luke, my goodness gracious, this seems like a problem. It says Jesus was Luke 18:35. Luke 18:35 says Jesus was approaching Jericho. So, Matthew and Mark say he was leaving Jericho, he and his disciples, but Luke says he was approaching Jericho, and it's pretty clearly the same story. I mean, some people would say, well, maybe it's two different healings because Jesus healed a lot of blind men. But you look at it in context, it really sounds like the same story. And so, some have said, well, that is a clear historical contradiction. I don't think it is, but this is one of those ones I mentioned before how sometimes I'm going to move my screen a little over here to help with this one so I can break on through to the other side. Break on through. Okay. So this is where a little historical background helps us out. They are either leaving or approaching a city called Jericho. You guys have heard of Jericho. What is Jericho famous for? Let the walls fall down. That's the city that was conquered by Joshua and the Israelites when they first entered Canaan. Here's the deal. In fact, yeah, I'll leave this. I think I can. Right, the Battle of Jericho. Jericho is a city that many different times was destroyed and rebuilt. It went through this a lot of times. Now, in the days immediately, in the days when Jesus was born, let's put it that way, there was this king in Israel. His name was Herod. He wasn't a very nice guy. King Herod is the guy who had the babies in Bethlehem under 3 years old killed. You guys remember that story? He wasn't a nice man, but King Herod, history knows King Herod as Herod the Great. And you're like, wait a minute, why on earth did they call King Herod Herod the Great? And I'm like, I'm so glad you asked. And they called him that because he built stuff. He built a lot of things that even have lasted to today, some of them. The temple in the days of Jesus, Herod built that. He was in the process of, at least he started the building on it. If you've ever heard of the Jewish fortress of Masada, he built that. The port in Caesarea, he built all kinds of things. One of the things Herod did was he rebuilt Jericho. The city was in ruins and he rebuilt it. Now, let's call this little line here the Jordan River. All right, just for fun, we're going to pretend this is the Jordan River. And when you enter Israel from this side of the Jordan River, at that place, the first city you come to is Jericho. That's why it's the first city Joshua and his people attacked. Now, the old city of Jericho, we'll just say, was right here, okay? But when King Herod decided he wanted to rebuild it, he didn't rebuild it right on top of the old city. He rebuilt it next to it. And Jerusalem, let's call this big dot Jerusalem. Jerusalem's like somewhere over here. So if you're going to Jerusalem across the Jordan, which is what Jesus was doing, he was headed to Jerusalem, the path would take you through both cities on the way to Jerusalem. So far, so good?
Is that why sometimes it's referred to as the New Jerusalem? I've heard it.
Not really, because the New Jerusalem is actually a city that God's going to bring about in the future when Christ comes back. So the New Jerusalem isn't really here yet. But this would be the New Jericho. Now let's put this in a little bit of historical context. Matthew and Mark say that Jesus was leaving Jericho. Matthew and Mark were Jewish. Let me just give you a historical background about the Jewish people and King Herod. The background is, even though King Herod was the king of Israel, he wasn't a Jew, and the Jews didn't like him. So far, so good? So Matthew and Mark would be much more likely to call this Jericho. However, Luke was not a Jew. He was a Gentile. He was a historian. He would have probably been a little less concerned about that. So Luke might have been more likely to call Herod's Jericho, Jericho. Now, assuming that Jesus healed the blind men, leaving the old city and approaching the new city, if Luke is talking about New Jericho and Matthew and Mark are talking about Old Jericho, no contradiction. It's just a matter of perspective. And what that illustrates for us is sometimes when we think we have a historical contradiction, sometimes you might not have all the information. Sometimes you might need to read a Bible commentary or some Bible history books, or ask your pastor, so I can do that because, that's my job or whatever. But usually when you see some sort of historical contradiction, there's kind of an explanation a lot like this that'll just make it melt away. Again, oh yeah, Bartimaeus. Yeah. Yeah, and the other two don't mention his name, so that means that one of the men's name was Bartimaeus. Now Mark probably mentions Bartimaeus, and this may explain why the other two said one blind man, or a blind man, I guess, because probably only one of them spoke. There's probably two guys together, but only one of them said, Jesus, have mercy on us. The point here, friends, as I tie this up, is just that, again, if you look at Gleason Archer's book, he does this with the entire Bible. And you're probably not going to, this isn't a page turner, right? You're probably not going to sit down with Gleason Archer's book and curl up by the fireplace and okay, next Bible contradiction, next Bible contradiction. It's more of a resource to look these things up. But he and others have done with the entire Bible and shown that when something appears to be a contradiction, the word appears is really important. There's a way of understanding that it's not a real contradiction. Again, our skeptic friends who are just determined not to believe the Bible is the Word of God, they may not accept that, but these really, you're probably noticing, none of these are really major threats to anything you hold dear. These are, again, the first time I taught this material, I was teaching it for a class as part of my internship at Dallas Seminary, and I was teaching with a teaching partner. He taught some of the subject, I taught some of the subject, and he was just saying the good old West Texas boy, and he's kind of had a good old West Texas accent. He's just like, if that's the best they got, they ain't got much. And his name was Jason, and I think Jason was right. These kinds of things, they're the biggest challenges to biblical inerrancy. The challenge isn't much. All right, last questions. Good for the night. Well, our online friends, thanks for joining us, and clear.